Hey, what's up, everybody? Good afternoon. I hope that you had a nice weekend. Today, we are going to continue discussing political behavior and just sort of introducing the context. We're going to start by defining political behavior and work with the definition that we're going to use in this class. And then we'll also take a look at some of the key questions and issue areas in this area of political science. I think that the goal is to expose ourselves to the key issues and the themes that we'll see in the class and that we want to think about from the very beginning so that we have kind of a sense of where we are, what the totality of the course really is. And what's unique about today's discussion is that we'll also address some implications that follow from some of the themes and some of the key questions in the literature. And so, for example, we'll talk about information and voter knowledge and whether or not the knowledge that a voter brings to the polls should impact on maybe how much their vote is weighted. There's an interesting controversy and discussion about voter information and voter knowledge and how it impacts politics, and we'll address that today. So the plan is to address economic voting on Wednesday and Friday, and to use that as a key example of accountability in how material circumstances and evaluations of one situation can affect politics and their participation. So we'll talk about the reading a little bit, but also incorporate some other examples. Let's go ahead and get started. As a reminder, we are recording. Hey, everybody, good to see you. Uh, let's get started. So if you've taken a comparative politics class, you've probably noticed that there's an emphasis on concepts. And we always try to develop concepts that can travel, that are encompassing enough and general enough that they can be useful in a variety of different contexts, and in particular, radically different contexts. The idea is we want to be able to use our definitions in as many places as possible. Just a moment, my kitten is having a fit. What's wrong, baby? Go. You want me to leave him out here? Birdie. I'm so sorry. Okay. Okay. So as you know, in comparative politics, we want to generate concepts that can travel. And in this class, we'll define political behavior in the following way so that we can use it in a variety of different contexts and really different situations. We'll define political behavior as individual or collective action at the national, regional, or local level that supports or opposes state structures, leaders, or policies. Now, I want you to pay close attention to the phrase supports or opposes. This is the very nature of politics, to take a side, to throw your weight behind one group or another, and to, in that way, try to alter the eventual outcome. This is about using your vote or using your influence in one way or another to try to shape the outcome. And it could be that you are promoting environmental justice, like pictured here, and you want to oppose a particular policy or exert pressure on the government to adopt some other policy. Maybe you're involved in grassroots efforts to mobilize support for the reelection of an incumbent government or a campaign. These are all examples of political behavior, but political behavior isn't all created equal. We can think of passive as well as active forms. And so when we think about how we behave politically, some of the types of behaviors that we would consider political in this literature you might not actually even think about in that way. And so the varying attitudes that you might have, or the beliefs that you have, or your attention to news media, all of these things are considered behavior from the perspective of the literature. And so these different issues become relevant. Your beliefs about politics, your knowledge, your willingness to participate in politics, your activity level, all of these things become relevant. Even those things that you don't consciously think of as political, like your attitudes or your sentiments or your trust in institutions, all count as political behavior. And so first, let's identify some different active forms of participation, the forms that we might observe in a variety of different circumstances or contexts, and they would all count as forms of active political participation or behavior. So the first and the most obvious is voting, and we'll spend much of the class discussing voting and the reasons that people choose to vote at all and why they vote in a certain way. And so voting is, of course, the most important, possibly the most important single act when it comes to politics, and especially democratic politics. It is that moment where you execute and choose or opt for one alternative among a variety of choices. And in doing so, you affect the outcome potentially in doing so. But it's not just you, a voter at the polls, who votes, it's also a legislator, a party, a Congress, and so on and so forth. And so parties and coalitions, as well as voters, all figure into a discussion about political participation. And you'll see in a moment how the behavior of parties becomes really relevant, especially when we talk about attitudes and beliefs about like populism or support for or against democracy. Letter writing and donating and phone banking, these are all things that count as political participation. Say you write a letter to a senator and you express your lack of support for a policy, or you express your support for a direction of public policy chosen by that senator. These are examples of participation, as are donating and phone banking. In this last election, a common thing that we saw was people volunteering to phone bank in a district that wasn't their own. This was especially common in swing states where people thought that the race was really on the line and they could maybe influence it even if they weren't technically able to vote and participate directly in that race. And in fact, Georgia became quite important as a battleground because of the runoff in January. And that period of time in between saw the registration of a lot of young voters, as well as a lot of outreach by people who didn't live in Georgia. These are all examples of participation. Of course, these examples stretch well beyond just the United States. I'm just using that as an example because it illuminates a recent event in our own collective memory that no doubt is probably still on our minds. Civil disobedience also constitutes participation, as does political violence, efforts to change the government, say insurrection, or efforts to maintain a government could also be an insurrection or a coup or an attempted coup. These are all forms of political participation that do, of course, stretch and reach beyond formal institutions and constitutional channels, but nevertheless still constitute political activity or action that would be interesting to study from a comparative perspective. And then, of course, there's behavior mobilized by the state. And this is also important in comparative perspective because authoritarian regimes, and especially totalitarian regimes, are much more likely to mobilize citizens and exert the kind of influence on their lives that might involve weekly meetings or activities that require them to leave their house and so on and so forth. We can look at all of these examples and think about how differences in institutions and in political environments might help to account for these different types of behaviors. Of course, the passive forms of behavior are equally interesting because they become consequential when you talk about direct or active forms of participation. And so these include attitudes and sentiments like patriotism and a strong sense of commitment to a country's institutions or its political process or its constitution or its framework. its values or what are perceived to be its values, we'll see that perceptions of values can differ, as can values themselves. Alienation and a sense of detachment or estrangement from politics is also relevant. It helps to account for disinterest or a lack of participation in politics, which is also consequential for the very reasons that well, when people choose not to participate, it leaves open a large gap, and it then draws into question the quality of representation and all sorts of things. And so you've probably heard that at the local level, fewer than 20% of the potential voters are actually often casting votes in races. And so local governments are often the most unrepresentative in terms of actually translating votes and preferences into outcomes. Of course, if people don't participate, it's difficult to gauge their preferences, especially if they're not voting or engaging in civic life. We'll talk in a moment about how and to what degree civic culture and norms around participation become important to democracy and these sorts of political behaviors that we consider valuable or that we assess in this class. And then apathy or indifference, these are also forms of participation or inactive or passive forms, if you will. And attention to politics in the media is also relevant in a discussion about participation. Are you highly engaged? Do you find yourself checking up regularly on what's happening in the news or what's most recent? If you are, you're likely very, very aware of politics, and you may be very passively engaged in addition to being very actively engaged. And oftentimes those who are passively engaged are also very often very actively engaged as well. And so in comparative political behavior, beginning with this understanding of political behavior as direct or indirect actions by individuals or groups aimed at supporting or opposing authorities, policies, or structures. With this definition and this understanding of active and passive forms of behavior, we can then identify those key areas of debate relating to this understanding of behavior and how we've thought of it in comparative political behavior. And those questions are, and those areas are as follows, and we'll deal with each of these individually and one by one, and we'll expose ourselves to them in a variety of ways. And as you'll see in a moment, I'm going to engage you, and I'd like to see what you think about a particular issue that comes from one of them. But these areas of debate relate to, first and foremost, mass behavior and attitudes and beliefs and abilities relating to information, sentiments, attitudes, preferences, etc. Secondarily, culture and values and the role of different social and political values in promoting or hindering democracy, voter choice, and why individuals choose the parties that they choose or select or promote the candidates they select. And then finally, the link between behavior, participation, and representation, and how closely the outcomes of government actually align with the preferences of the voting public. And as you'll see, all of these issues are analytical, but they're also often political as well. And they get to often much deeper questions about democratic representation, the quality of democracy. And so in this class, obviously political behavior seems more consistent with democratic politics because of the numerous channels to participate in politics. Though there are forms of political behavior in all types of regimes, we will focus on those democratic implications or those implications for democracy. You'll see that there are a lot of important questions about information and participation, knowledge, and deeper questions even about enfranchisement and the relative weight or influence of groups, and in particular questions about knowledge and whether voter knowledge is a requisite for meaningful participation. So the first area concerns mass behavior and attitudes, beliefs, and abilities. And the biggest question in this literature has been, how much do voters know about politics? This has been the question since the 1950s, when the earliest books on this topic were done, and they came from these big surveys that were conducted to try to figure out how much information voters actually had when they went to the polls and how well prepared they were knowledge-wise to actually participate. And for many decades, the consensus was not much. And the literature really had a low view of voters as these unsophisticated dolts who, more or less just kind of, voted ignorantly without much guidance, so to speak. Now, the new consensus is very, very different. The newest surveys show and reveal voters to be much savvier. And the newest data and conclusions seem to suggest that voters know a great deal. It's just that how much they know about particular issues and when it matters varies and can vary. And so the debates continue, but the view of voters as unsophisticated and uninformed really is an old view that doesn't accurately depict the way they're viewed these days. And so knowledge is power from the perspective of the authors in this literature who believe that, who start from this sort of assumption that voter information is essential because only then can voters participate in a meaningful way. And this is a moment where I pause and I kind of give you a chance to think about this for a moment and think about the issues that are involved. And one of the interesting issues is the question of whether democratic politics is damaged by uninformed voting. If we're worse off because of the participation of, supposedly uninformed voters, are we stuck with outcomes that are suboptimal? Does representation or governance suffer as a result of a lack of information? If we can conclude safely that there's a lack of information or that voters are uninformed, is their lack of sophistication in some circumstances detrimental? Should we be concerned? And there's actually an interesting debate, and you maybe have heard this before. Sometimes people argue that your vote should count less if you're not politically informed. In this discussion highlights some of the issues involved and some of the stakes. The very vote itself could be at stake if those who take this view got their way. And in a moment, I'm actually going to show you a video that puts this in perspective, because I just think that it's a good way of highlighting the implications. And it's devised by an economist, this sort of, I guess, proposal. And it's interesting to see how an economist views politics in this sort of more efficiency-driven way, where the outcomes could be harmed or undermined by a lack of information possessed by the participants. Now, before we get there, I'm going to check up on the chat because I have a feeling that some of you may have commented. Yeah, normally so my kitten's name is Bernie. Well, our kitten, I should be clear. My wife actually had the idea of getting him, but I couldn't do without him. He's like my best friend. But normally I will bring him into the, to the camera and lecture a little bit if he wants some attention. But he, I think, is in the other room under the covers. Christopher says active participation equal texting, banking, and candidate social media apps. Well, sure. If you're actively communicating political information in an effort to influence behavior, that's participation. You're trying to influence support or opposition to a candidate. In a more disconnected way, it is participation. Gustavo, these are forms of participation that reach across countries. I gave you some examples, but there are many others. Okay, so let's watch this video. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
The fact that the OECD report claims that this generation of Americans, for the first time in the history of the United States, will be less educated than the preceding generation means that we do need to do something quite aggressive, I believe, in order to get more voters to the ballot polls. The idea of weighted voting is essentially providing a reward to voters who are more engaged. One of the risks of this proposal is that people will interpret it very superficially as rewarding or giving people who've got more education or more wealth a bigger weight in the voting process. And that is absolutely incorrect. The most important thing, I believe, for democracy to function is two things. One is to make sure that as many people as possible are voting. And so, in that context, one of the concerns is low voter participation rates. In the United States, they are now around 50%. For low income households, they're around 30%. But the second thing that's critically important is that voters have an understanding of the political process. One of the big issues that has been revealed is that we're seeing a lot of disaffection, and people tend to vote for candidates based on things as basic as what color pantsuit they're wearing. And that, I think, is really undermines the political process. Discussing what sorts of factors would help us understand who should be voting and how voters should be voting. I believe that having a civics program where people really understand how the government functions and who they're voting for and what those people stand for, at a very bare minimum, a civics test, and I draw really on my experience as an immigrant, would really tap into the historical context of how exactly the United States political system was established, but more specifically, we'll talk about how it's structured today. For example, just a basic understanding of what the different arms of government are and how the political process works, from the role of superdelegates and delegates, but it's also about how primaries work and how the whole process of the caucusing and the electoral college works in a democratic system. And I think that's at a very bare minimum would help voters understand what the role of their vote is and how that actually would impact not just on the election process, but also long-term economic policy. Because I'm an eternal optimist and because we have a history where people of color were not allowed to vote, women were not allowed to vote, I imagine that there were times when there was pause and people thought, well, we really can't have a system where women voted or where minorities voted. But here we are today in a world where it is possible. And so on that basis, I don't see why we shouldn't be optimistic about reforms and innovation to the democratic process that can make it stronger and perform better. We want to make sure that people do have access to information about the candidates that they're fielding, but also make sure that they have understanding about the basic political and policy issues that are up for debate.
So this is a radical proposal, and I only show you this because I want to show you some of the issues that are involved and draw out some of the implications of debates about the importance of information and how far you could potentially take it if you really, really valued information and knowledge above all. And it's unsurprising that an economist would put this forward. Economists care deeply about information. They believe that markets only function if everyone is fully informed. And in fact, most of their models assume that actors are fully informed. That gives you a sense of how much they value knowledge. And so from the perspective of an economist, you could see how they might come up with something like this. This is an issue everywhere, not just in the US. But I think that in a developing country, there would be especially difficult questions about the feasibility of something like this because education levels already vary considerably within the population. And there are real questions about what limits you would put on an emerging democracy's electorate when you seek to develop a meaningful sense that elections matter and that their participation is meaningful.
The fact that
And so I'm actually going to just put up a poll really quickly, and I'm just curious what you think. I want to just get a sense of where you are and see how much you might value knowledge and information and how much you might associate it with democratic governance or the quality of democracy. And so I'm I think, aware of how the vote might go, but sometimes I'm surprised and I'd just like to see what your opinion is. And so I'm launching a poll right now and we'll take a second to just get people's feeling on this. So this is very decisive, and it was done very quickly. And I think that I anticipated that this might be the result. Around 76% of you, a large supermajority of you said no. 48 of you at this point. I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Take a look. 48 or 76% of you said no. 15 or 24% of you said yes. And I'm curious, does anyone want to comment or share their reasoning for saying yes or no? Why why should a voter's vote count for less if they're uninformed, and why should it not?
Um,
Um,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure. Personally, I picked no because I feel like while people can be politically informed, I feel like it'd be stripping away in part some of their rights because everybody has the right to vote. And it would be stripping away their rights if we were to make their vote count any more or less than somebody that is politically informed, if that makes sense.
It does, Layla, and I think that what you're saying is that, look, if the goal is to strengthen democracy, well, doesn't it kind of defeat the point if you take away the foundation, which is the right to vote or to have your vote counted? And so, in that respect, it might be self-defeating, and I think that's a great point. Uh, Claudia, would you want to comment?
Yeah, so what I was going to say is that while I think that education about like civic duties and politics is super important, I think that a country's soft power has a lot to do with a very large participation number of citizens. Because, yeah, education goes so far, but with voter ID laws and people not being able to actually like qualify to vote, like what does it matter if they're not politically informed? Like there's just so many factors that go into it that like adding a education requirement for how politically informed you are, just it oppresses the vote even more already than it already is in most places.
Yeah, it kind of feels like sort of like the educational equivalent of like a poll tax, or like you have to cross this threshold. And I don't think it's coincidental that it was an economist who developed the idea. Josette, do you want to make a comment?
Oh, sorry. I did not press on mute. But I actually never mind.
Oh, please.
Sorry, I didn't know. But I did vote yes on that actually. But I know like not in a true democracy or anything like that. That it doesn't like everybody should be treated equally with their vote. But I just think that like I don't know, I just personally think people should be educated on that. But I think I just kind of voted yes on that to be a little more rebellious. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Look, I say it always. We should be able to make an argument for both positions, and that means thinking creatively and critically, and just being prepared to say something that could defend a point, just for the purpose of reasoning it out.
Yeah, I was also I voted no, but the more that I think about it, the more I could see a case for yes, because of the way that politics is in America today. As the economist was saying, people are voting by the color of the pantsuit. While I don't think it's that specific, I do think there's a lot of tribalism that goes on in politics right now today, and especially within the last 4 years, we saw the devaluation of how facts were. So I think the idea of forcing the general public to understand the system and how politics works, which I think has to be a part of it, because I don't think you can just do like effectively a recreation of a literacy task without a specific education for it. But in spite of that, if that exists, I think it would be a good idea to add political engagement and civics for the nation to allow for a de-escalation of tribalism and supporting the blue team or red team, and sort of exploring why you support the issues that you support, not just whatever color the party is.
Yeah, so like an engagement with politics on substantive grounds instead of like, you know, what we sort of have. And I think that the example and the reference to the United States is good, and this is clearly a video about the U.S., but I do think the issues and the questions relate to many experiences, and the question is always, how do you educate and inform voters, and especially since they're wielding the power to elect representatives who will act on their behalf. Jose says that the barrier of education and unequal access to education complicates the situation, even if we value education. I think that that's a good way of putting it, and it highlights some of the challenges that come from the simple fact that there are many different income levels and different experiences in any democracy, and treating them as all the same and demanding the same of them is often untenable and unfeasible. And the values of inclusiveness and solidarity that we often associate with democracy tend to leave very little space for some of these demands that we might place on voters. I don't think that the problem goes away by any stretch, but you see that it's a challenging issue. And in this debate, in this literature about how much voters know, lurking behind this discussion is this set of assumptions about the value of informed voters. And then the question becomes, well, what do you do to get them informed if what we care about above all is the knowledge that they come with to the polls? Hope says representatives should use their political knowledge in place for their constituents. Even though I did vote yes, I do acknowledge that what makes our country what it is that everyone's vote matters. I think the issue stems from the representatives not representing the people and who voted for them. So this link between participation and representation, yeah, it's tenuous often. And this is where we begin to pick at democratic institutions, and we wonder if elections are producing meaningful results. And it sometimes becomes difficult to know what exactly is at fault. And I think that is sometimes the source of some of the dissatisfaction with democracy. And right now, it's an interesting and important time for a discussion like this because obviously there's a lot of misinformation, and trust and faith and confidence in democratic institutions is on the is on the it's on the mend, so to speak, right? It's not in good shape. Hope says, for example, I only vote when I'm personally informed. Touche. Christopher says that is your choice. Good for being a good an individual. Claudia says, I also think that until our decision our education is comprehensive and equitable across populations, there's no way to validate an education requirement. Yeah, touche. My feeling too. Jose says sometimes people put their faith in the person they elected to serve them in their interests. This is an interesting point. After all, it is representative democracy, is it not? And so what's the point of having these representatives if we don't elect them for the purpose of deciding for us? And this is a sound point to make if you're taking the position that no education requirements might not be feasible. And it goes to the heart of what democracy is. It's representative.
Hey, Professor, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
How does this debate differ in like direct democracy versus like representative democracy, where in the case of like the general presidential election, where we technically vote for our electors, versus a direct democracy where like one vote or one person equals one vote kind of thing?
Yeah, well, good question. I think that the answer that many of the authors in this literature would give you is that the difference might not be meaningful. It might be a distinction without a difference. Because in our system in the United States, it's actually quite difficult for electors to vote faithlessly, as they say. There are some limits on what they can do. They usually have to kind of fairly and faithfully represent the voters in the district. And so I think that the authors in this literature would say that in both cases they're voting, and so they need to be educated, because whether they're voting directly or someone will vote on their behalf once they cast their popular vote, it will be an important outcome that will have a consequence. So I think that education still stays quite relevant. Arlene says, my question is, how would they go about knowing how well informed you are politically? Like, some people are more informed of some issues opposed to others. Yeah, I know it's not feasible from that angle, because what do you do? Do you give everyone the same test? Who decides what's on the test, and so on. Hargan says, I like the concept of everyone having the availability of education on the subject and making an educated vote, but not everyone has those resources. And a question I have for this would be, who decides how much education is enough? Yeah, agreed. And moreover, I think that there's a real problem if education is not a robust social service, and if we don't have access to higher education freely, for example, but we agree that civics are important, um, does that create some responsibility for the state, to invest more in education? So this is such a good discussion, and I feel like we could go on forever. I'm going to continue, and we can continue to incorporate some of these insights as we go. The second area of investigation in comparative political behavior relates to the role of culture and values, and in particular, how culture and values affect democracy and the prospects for democracy. So the key question has always been, does culture support and sort of lead to democracy? Do values of engagement, equality, and solidarity, tolerance, do these foster democracy? And if these values erode, does democracy erode correspondingly? And then more recently, a key question has been, are citizen orientations towards government changing? Is there an increasing dissatisfaction with government, or a lack of confidence or trust in political institutions? Is there a deterioration of confidence or faith that these governments will produce outcomes that are desirable and representative? Is civic culture in decline because of new technologies that have delinked and separated voters and interrupted traditional social networks? Some people and some authors have argued that television, social media more recently, can have a positive or a negative effect. And television especially has been argued to be a contributor to a decline in social and political trust. And a corresponding sort of erosion of democracy has followed, according to some of these thinkers. And so one of the key areas of controversy and debate has been, what sorts of cultural values are most conducive to democracy, and are some cultures less than conducive for reasons that are fundamental to their very essence? And as you can see, this is a controversial set of discussions, because not only does it verge on um, racist in some cases, but the very meaning and value of a concept like culture is sometimes in question. It can be viewed and seen as quite empty and meaningless from some perspectives. It can kind of become this vacuous catch-all for a lot of characteristics that are sort of wishy-washy and that we have a difficult time putting our finger on. And so culture then is very, very controversial, and it's a question that remains a matter of debate. But one thing is for sure, there seems to be a consensus that citizen orientations towards government have begun to change, in that attitudes have become oftentimes stronger, and dissatisfaction with democratic institutions has been increasing. And so one way of thinking about and illustrating this is to take a look at the behavior of political parties in Europe, where there's been an increase in nationalist and populist, sort of far right political parties that openly oppose democracy often and are supportive of all authoritarian alternatives, or at a bare minimum don't support or promote equality or solidarity. And so I want to watch this video with you, and I want to use this as an illustration of the behavior of parties, which is another type of actor whose behavior we study in this class. And I want you to pay attention to the characteristics and the circumstances around the populism and the nationalism that this video argues is undermining democracy in Europe. And this is a video about the sort of cultural foundations of politics in the contemporary period.
3 European politicians. They speak different languages, but they're all singing the same tune.
L'Union européenne, c'est une véritable épouvante.
Mai rendetlen Európa képtelen megoldásokat találni ezekre a kihívásokra.
Noi andiamo in Europa per ribaltarla questa Europa.
And that's weird, because one belief that unites these nationalist, populist European leaders is that the European Union should be less united. Since the Euro crisis of 2009 and the migrant crisis of 2015, these right-wing populist movements have grown in strength and in number.
Európa már most invázió alatt áll. 10 és 10 milliók indulnak meg Európába, Afrikából és a közel-keletről.
His campaign against Muslim refugees won his party 2/3 of the seats in Hungary's general election in 2018. Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party doesn't sound all that different.
Co się dzieje we Francji? Nieustanna awantura, też wprowadzany szariat.
Law and Justice won an outright majority in 2015. Every European country has its own version. Tomio Okamura is a Czech nationalist politician born in Japan who wants a zero-tolerance policy on immigration.
Nemůžeme si dovolit zaplavit naše země migranty z nepřátelských a nekompatibilních kultur.
It's not clear what this means, but it plays into European fears of what they call an invasion. In other words, immigration.
I would stop immigration of non-Western immigrants immediately.
They all accuse Brussels of behaving like a dictatorship.
Jsme pod totálním diktátem Bruselu a v podstatě jsme ztratili jakoukoliv samostatnost. Těch je celá řada.
Which is ironic, given that they're all running in democratic elections for the EU Parliament. They often speak of a supposed plot by mainstream leaders like Angela Merkel to replace Europeans with lower-paid migrants.
Sono convinto che l'immigrazione sia un progetto studiato e finanziato per sostituire etnicamente i popoli europei con nuovi schiavi da pagare a 3 euro all'ora per il loro lavoro.
And they tend not to like feminism or gay rights. They may say some provocative or even hateful things, but their language and ideas are consistent all across Europe, and they are clearly effective. Pollsters predict that these Eurosceptic parties will see a significant rise in votes in the European election. Ironically, it's the Eurosceptic parties that seem to be doing the best job building pan-European politics. The question is whether the parties that believe in a stronger Europe can do the same thing.
It's noteworthy that Orban in Hungary has presided over the erosion of democracy in that country, and his party, with tight control of the parliament, was able to push through measures that concentrated power in his hands, and all sort of under the banner of this anti-democratic and this anti-immigrant rhetoric. This rhetoric is just ensconced with this sort of, I guess, nods against equality, nods against solidarity that would be inconsistent with democracy. Democracy is understood culturally as being about about equality and solidarity, tolerance, at least from the perspective of civic culture and the debate in the literature. And so Europe in the political parties on the populist far right give you a sense of the ways that parties will behave in circumstances where they feel like there's maybe an incentive to appeal to fearful Europeans who might be concerned about economic or social changes that they don't anticipate or that they didn't see coming. And so this is often what we see. Parties will take advantage of that dissatisfaction or that concern, and they'll try to exploit it for their political gain. The third area is the area of voter choice. Now, this pertains to the motivations that get people to vote the way they do and why they support the leaders they support or the parties they support. And this is a huge literature that traces everything from the role of race and gender to the role of income or ethnicity or religion, evaluations of one's financial situation, that is economic voting. It considers the role of the economy, the government's performance. It considers the proximity to political parties in terms of ideas or values. It considers all sorts of circumstances that might influence why voters would choose certain candidates. And in a class like this, we can, of course, only cover the very surface, and there are questions that will remain unanswered, no doubt, but we'll take a look in particular at economic voting. We'll look at partisanship and how it drives voting. And we'll look at accountability and how voters make choices that they use to then hold politicians accountable. Let me take a look at the chat. There's a lot of activity here. Yeah, Orban is now a dictator. And as I commented, that erosion into dictatorship, it had a strong cultural component in values of inequality, and anti-immigrant rhetoric played an important role. So voter choice is this latest area of investigation for us. And the last area of investigation is one that's no less important, and it has to do with the precise link between participation and representation. And we've defined behavior as already as direct and indirect actions targeted at supporting or opposing state structures, authorities, leaders, or policies. And the question now becomes, how effective is that behavior in bringing about the desired outcome? Do policies and political choices and policy choices of leaders elected by voters actually align with the preferences of those voters who elected them? And in general, how does opinion impact policymakers and governments? To what extent do lawmakers' views in their policies embody those preferences? And in the United States, at least, the studies in the conclusion seem to be not at all. Politicians have been shown to listen primarily to rich people and the very highest earners, and in particular, not just high earners, but also large corporations who can donate significant amounts of money in politics. And this, of course, will relate closely to campaign finance laws and the incentives around responding to deep-pocketed donors. And so it might not surprise you that the system rewards those people and not necessarily ordinary voters. But more generally, the question in this literature is, how strong is the link between participation and representation in a democracy? And what explains the nature of the link? And how can we strengthen that link? And so there are both analytical and political questions that come up in this discussion. Listen, everybody, we're out of time, and I did have a little bit more in mind, but I think that we've covered a lot, and I appreciate your input. I appreciate your energy and enthusiasm. Thanks as always. I'm going to stop the recording and you're free to go. I'll see you on Wednesday.